All right. Excuse me. Okay, so welcome back. So we're continuing our discussion of St. Thomas Aquinas. We've looked at his metaphysics and how his metaphysics is related to his theology. We've looked at how he uses Aristotle's four categories in order to explain the existence of everything, but also within everything is the nature of human nature. And we've been focusing on the final cause of human nature, understood as the answer to the question, what is a human being for? Now, in the previous lecture, we looked at two different options for answering that question, and they really are either it's either this one or that one, setting aside the possibility of nihilism. So either human beings come up with their own definition of happiness, with just within the paradigm of consent is that which structures and guides action, but other than that, people are free to define happiness however they so choose, and we looked at some challenging implications of that view. Or happiness is defined in an objective way, just as there's an objective definition of what constitutes health. There's an objective definition of what constitutes the good for human beings, happiness for human beings. And this is going to be the model that Thomas Aquinas is going to embrace. Within that model, he's going to recognize something called natural happiness or imperfect happiness, and supernatural happiness or perfect happiness, not as in conflict, but rather one leading to the other. All right, so the claim that Aquinas now wants to make is that not only does everybody seek happiness as their final good, so the preliminary answer to the question, what is a human being for, is to be happy. So he thinks that it's the case that everyone seeks to be happy, but he's going to make the argument on top of that that everybody seeks actually the same definition of happiness. If we pause and actually look at sort of the sequence of reasoning that leads to that conclusion, we'll see that we all come to eventually the same conclusion. So that'll be the argument we're going to go through in this lecture. The first point that he has to make and then defend is that everybody acts for some end or acts or for some goal. Now, we went through a version of this when we examined the thought of St. Augustine. And it basically just asks us to look at the structure of our own action. And everybody can look at his action or her action and say, well, how does it work? What am I doing when I act? So setting aside the internal mechanism, which is important, we're going to return to that, the anatomy of action and virtue. Just think simply in terms of what is an action for? Well, what Aquinas would argue, and again, he's within the tradition of Augustine here, is that we always act for some end or some goal or some purpose. In fact, we can't understand action independent of it being related to a goal, end, or purpose. Why? Action detached from a goal would literally be action without meaning, without purpose. It would be kind of it would be more of a twitch or more of a reflex that rather than a voluntary action. So action, in order to be voluntary, has to be reasonable in this specific sense, in this context, that it has to have a reason for its existence, which is just a fancy way of saying we act in order to accomplish something. Okay, well, he thinks if you're on board for that specific point, and he would argue it's hard not to be, then we have to recognize that every action that we act for is it's a preliminary action on the way to some other action or some other goal, I should say. It's a preliminary goal on the way to some higher or more general goal. So the example we used with St. Augustine is that the reason that, say you were taking this class not online, but in actually in a traditional classroom setting. So the reason that you go to class, and this is this one potential sequence of reasoning, but I don't think I'm being presumptuous here, is the reason you go to class is because you want a good participation grade. And the reason you want a good participation grade, right, so that's one goal, but that doesn't end there. There's a goal that explains that goal. The reason you want to get a good participation grade is because you want to get a good grade in the class. But you see there's actually a higher goal that structures those two more minor goals. The reason you want to get a good grade in the class is because you want to get a high GPA. So one goal explaining those two other minor goals and also other actions as well. Like not partying all the time would be another explanation for action. For the goal would be another explanation for why you show some restraint. Okay, so you want to get a high GPA overall. But why do you want to do that? Well, because you want to get into a good graduate school. Well, and you can see where this is going, right? Well, why do you want to do that? And you could say, because I want to get a good job. And why do you want to get that? Because I want to get a good salary. Why do you want to get that? Because I want to get a nice home and nice cars. And why do you want to get that? So you can just keep going, going, going. And what Aquinas, again, with Augustine would say, is that that can't go on forever. That at some point, the reason why you do absolutely everything is because there's some one goal that you're after. And that one goal explains every other goal beneath it, that in turn explains the goals beneath it, explains the goals beneath, but none of them make sense without that anchor goal, or that goal, that final end, as he puts it, that final purpose. That, he says, and he's also echoing Aristotle here as well, that, he says, is called happiness. That the reason we do what we do ultimately is because we are seeking happiness. And it's important to recognize that in our seeking of happiness, we can say that at any given time there can be different goals. And those goals might even be different goals. I mean, they might be in conflict, is what I mean. His point would be that what your happiness is when you have those two goals in conflict, it would be the goal that you choose over another goal. So, for example, I could say, my goal in life is to make as much money as possible, and my goal in life is to spend as much time as possible with my children. So make as much money as possible, spend as much time as possible with my children. Well, you see, those two goals are pretty immediately going to conflict. And I can't do both of them at the same time in the same way, in a literal sense. I can't do that because of the way that the economy is structured, and my life is structured, and reality is structured. I can't do both things at the same time, so I'll have to choose one. Now, this doesn't mean I won't still, let's say I hopefully choose spending time with my children over making money. Now, that doesn't mean that making money is not, suddenly falls off the boat and is unimportant, but it's then becomes contingent upon a higher goal. So again, it's not that we can't have different goals or that those goals can't be in conflict. The recognition, rather, is that happiness ultimately structures all the goals in relationship to each other, creating a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is all ordered and given intelligibility by that one final point. And that point is happiness. So Aquinas believes we all act for that. And so the final purpose of a human being, the reason that a human being is in order to be happy. And he thinks the evidence for that is just, you know, it's as plain as the nose on your face. He's saying my grandma used to say, right? It's just obviously there that that's what we do, and that's the purpose of life, is to be happy. But remember, he's going to make an additional claim on top of that. He's going to say, not only are we all after happiness, we're actually all after the same definition of happiness. Now, that could be quite a stretch for a lot of people, right? So maybe somebody would be willing to go along with the conclusion that we all act for some definition of the happiness, and that's what explains everything that we do. But it would be another thing to say, but we all agree on that same definition of happiness. Many people would probably, particularly in our time and place, our culture, would say, no, no, no. Again, going back to this idea that happiness is a radically subjective definition, that each person has to pursue his or her own definition of happiness. Okay, well, that's the claim that Aquinas wants to test. Is that true? So over here, we have some possible definitions of what could define that highest goal. So it's one thing to say that we all act for happiness. That's what's called a formal definition. We'll give, we tag that as happiness, but then we want a substantive definition, meaning a definition that defines what happiness actually means. So he goes through, this is Aquinas, he goes through some different potential explanations or definitions of what those could be. And this is his list right here. I've modified it a bit to, I've combined some things to come up with these and use some different language, but they're pointing to the same arguments he's making. He says, well, maybe the highest good that we all could be after is wealth, the accumulation of wealth. Or maybe it could be the accumulation of having honor or a good reputation, or maybe fame, or maybe power, becoming as powerful as possible, or pleasure, having as much pleasure as possible, or health, living as long as possible without pain. Or maybe it's something else, he says. Maybe there's something else in the world, and by world I mean within time and space, that I'm overlooking? This is Aquinas speaking. And so what might that be? Okay, well, he thinks that we can go through each one of these options and actually recognize that while it may be a good, it's a conditional good, meaning it can't be defined from a rational perspective as our highest good. So let's go through them one by one, and I'll give Aquinas's response to each one, which he believes. Thomas Aquinas believes that you would have the exact same thinking that he has, not because it's his thinking, but because you're going to necessarily be led to the same conclusion by the same structure of reason that we all share. The same way that, you know, it's not just my opinion that it's impossible to conceive of a circular square, right? What I'm doing is in making that claim, it's impossible to conceive of a circular square. I'm not asserting something in the sense of I'm just telling you what I think, but not, you know, just accepting you just to believe it just because I'm saying it. Rather, I'm saying something that is embedded in the structure of logic itself. So that's what Aquinas thinks he's doing here. Is he's not, this isn't just his argument or his fancy. He thinks this is true for everyone all the time. So, wealth. Can wealth be the definition of that which is the highest good? Well, each one of these we have to recognize could potentially be a serious contender. When we do look at human behavior, especially, well, maybe everywhere, but especially here, right? A lot of what we do is motivated by getting more money. And we have to be clear here. He's not going to be arguing that any one of these things is bad or that you shouldn't be doing it. His argument is going to be related to the question, can it be our highest good? So perhaps we perceive that a lot of people do pursue wealth or the accumulation of resources as that which structures everything else in their life, but is it rational to do so? His argument is no, it's not. Why? For two primary reasons. One, wealth in and of itself is understood as a medium of exchange, meaning that wealth in and of itself is not valuable. It's valuable only insofar as what? It gives you access to other things that you want, right? So wealth must be understood not as a kind of good in and of itself, because insofar as what we're pursuing is wealth, we're pursuing it in order to have something else. And that includes, you know, the old school forms of wealth when people used to carry around coins, for example, or even paper, but it especially becomes apparent now. I mean, most wealth now is either embedded in assets, which are real things, but if we're thinking of them as wealth, they're things that we can trade in for something else, or it's just it's zeros and ones, right? Our wealth is made palpable to us only on a screen, and it's the only way we can translate that into something that we want is to move that around. So wealth, by definition, is a tool for getting something that you desire. If that's true, then it can't be, insofar as it's a tool to get what you want, it can't actually be what you want. The other issue, and this is an issue that will come up with others in these other categories as well, is that when we're trying to conceive of that which is our highest good, what we're trying to do is conceive of something that we want to obtain and beyond which there is nothing else that we would want to obtain, meaning that our desires actually come to rest, that you've gotten the goal, right? You've obtained it, and now you move from pursuing to enjoying. Well, if you're saying that wealth is your highest good, what you're saying is that at some level, better put this way, that there's no level, given the nature of the good, at which you would ever be satisfied. Why? Because it's always conceptually possible and numerically possible. I mean, it's actually empirically possible to have plus one, plus one, plus one, plus one, plus one. So if wealth is your highest good, this would be the formulation of your life. My goal in existence is to pursue as much wealth as possible. So then that would mean that any time that you accumulate wealth, by definition, it would immediately dissolve into a new desire to accumulate more wealth, which would dissolve into an immediate desire to accumulate more wealth, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. Meaning defining wealth as your highest good is defining your highest good as something that you could never actually obtain, which for Aquinas, and perhaps we can just appeal to our experiential way of engaging with the world as well. I mean, does it really make sense to say that you're always going to be pursuing more and more and more and more and more? For Aquinas, no. It's irrational to say my highest good is something that can never be obtained. So for those reasons, he thinks wealth is not an option. Well, how about honor or reputation? Now, again, these are, let me go back just for a second. Wealth's not bad. Money's not bad. It just can't be defined as your highest good. Something also to keep in mind here, Aquinas isn't saying that people don't try to make these things your highest goods, their highest goods. He's not saying that people don't actually act as if wealth weren't their highest good. What he's saying is it's always irrational. And insofar as it's irrational, it's always going to lead to absurd conclusions, right? Like the conclusion that what makes me happy in life is never to be happy. That would be the result, the consequence of making wealth your highest good. So people do absurd things all the time, according to Aquinas. Remember, we are free to act against our nature, but that doesn't mean that acting against our nature changes the true definition of what happiness is. That would be his point. So how about honor and reputation? Okay, well, this is a serious one as well to take very seriously. So you can think of somebody who has obtained a significant amount of wealth, a significant amount of success in her or his field. And so, getting up in age, one's thoughts can turn to the idea, well, what do I want? I want to leave a legacy. This is kind of a nice idea of legacy, right? I want people to remember me fondly. I want my name to sort of be a glowing memento in the minds of as many people as possible. And that when their thoughts do turn to me, they remember something good. So one way of conceiving that, of saying, well, you want to have a good reputation. You want to be perceived well by other people. Now, if we want to just sort of immediately write that off, it's like, well, who wants to do that? I know people now are like, the young people are not into the Facebook as much anymore, but there's still quite a bit. But the like thing, the people who put together Facebook, not just Zuckerberg, but everybody else. One of the co-founders even admitted to this as much, as they use psychological research to develop this idea. There's no thumb down, but there is a thumb up, that people get literally addicted to trying to get thumbs up on their posts and on their pictures and stuff like that. So don't tell me that we're not interested in being perceived well by other people, by existing in their minds in such a way that they see us as in a positive light, and that we sort of occupy real estate in their own lives and do so in a way where they're well disposed to us. So it appears to be a serious potential. There's something to take very seriously in defining our highest good. Okay, well, what's wrong with honor and reputation? Nothing, again, in and of itself. Aquinas is not saying it's bad to have a good reputation, but it would be wrong, he thinks, to identify as your highest good. Why? Well, first of all, like wealth, you can always potentially have more people who are well disposed to you. And so insofar as you get, 5 likes or 10 likes or 100 likes or 50 likes, 50,000 likes, whatever, there's always 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So from that perspective alone, you will never be happy, because you will never obtain that which you want to obtain, because you've defined it in a way that it's impossible to obtain. Always more. And again, looking at the social media landscape, this is really instructive. Think of, our kids talk about this guy named PewDiePie on the YouTube. I've never seen it, but apparently he has like 20 million subscribers. That's a lot. 20 million subscribers. I mean, that's a ton of people, and PewDiePie should be very happy, I suppose, that there's 20 million people. But if a fraction of humanity, of a percentage of humanity, it's a fraction, right? 20 million people is a barely noticeable blip if you're talking about a global population in the billions. and the billions and billions and billions. So on the one hand, you can say, wow, well, relative to other people, I have a lot more, but I really don't have that many in an absolute sense. So if I define just by subscribers what the next one is, I've got a lifetime and then some to go, and I'll never get there, right? So that plus one is really something to take seriously. Again, you'll never get it. You'll never get it. And if that's your highest good, you're saying what makes me happy in life is never to get what I most want, right? So that would be a problem, at least according to Aquinas. Here's the other issue here, is that by definition, people who seek to have a good reputation, meaning the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is that so you will like me and you will think good of me. Aquinas says that's not good. That's actually a character defect that we might call something like vanity or ambition or pride. He says the only way that honor or good reputation is actually good is if you get it because you're being good, not because you're pursuing it, but because you're actually doing something that is worthy of having a good reputation, not because you're actually pursuing it. Again, think of if you were interacting with somebody whose only goal in that interaction was to get you to like them, was to get you to get like real estate in your head and to get you to like, you become instrumentalized, right? You become sort of manipulated. Like, wait a minute, I thought maybe we were actually talking to have a conversation, but you just want another follower or something like that. So for Aquinas, you can't define good reputation or honor as your highest good, because those who would seek it as their highest good are being vain and therefore not deserving of a good reputation. Another issue with this one too, very quickly, is that a good reputation depends upon what? It depends upon other people. And so what you're doing is you'd be defining your highest good and putting it in the hands of individuals, even a lot of individuals, but putting in the hands of people who ultimately may or may not see you accurately. So, for example, you could spend your whole life doing the good, doing right, being just, being fair, not lying, not taking advantage of people, taking the hard choice when it's, you could either, stab somebody in the back and get a raise, or not stab somebody in the back, watch some really snotty punk ultimately get the position that you think you deserve. But you said to yourself, no, I'm not going to do it because it's bad. I don't want to hurt somebody in order to advance in my career. So you could be that person and end up never being known by anybody, or at least by the outside of a small circle of your family. Likewise, you could be perceived as being a really good person and be rotten on the inside. So these things, it doesn't matter what other people perceive or don't perceive in terms of your highest good. You can lose everything in a minute in terms of people's perception of you. Your highest good must be something, one, that can be obtained, and two, that can't be taken away from you. Otherwise, it can't be, according to Aquinas, your highest good. So that's not going to work either, not honor, reputation. Fame. Well, we're going to run into the same problems with fame, right? The same problems that we see with honor, reputation with fame. But there's an additional twist here, right? You can be famous for being evil. So fame, honor, reputation, at least is attached to some conception of what's good. Fame can be totally disconnected from any conception of what's good. And we see that all the time. I mean, one of the most famous names that you hear in politics and you hear in academia, it sort of become like the golden standard to identify what's evil is Nazism and Hitler, right? Certainly one of the most evil person who's ever existed, and at the same time very, very famous, right? So whose name do you think will still be uttered by people's lips in, say, in 200 years? Justin Bieber, the Kardashians, or Hitler, right? So again, Aquinas would say you could be famous for being wicked. And so insofar as you're being wicked, that's the very opposite of what your highest good is. And so fame in that sense becomes totally disconnected from your happiness. But let's say you are a good person and you do become famous for that. Well, one, again, that can be taken away from you. And two, you can always have that plus one problem, right, with fame. So fame is in a distinctive category in relationship to honor reputation because it can be connected to something evil, but at the same time has the same problems as honor reputation, so it doesn't make sense. Which is, we're taking this class in LA. It's curious, right? It's curious why people want to be famous when we really get to thinking about it. Is fame a good in and of itself? And if it is a good in and of itself, how in the world can we explain what its ultimate purpose is? Aquinas thinks it's irrational. It's actually absurd to define fame as your highest good. So think about that in the context of Los Angeles. All right. So can't be wealth for him, can't be honor reputation, can't be fame. So how about power? Well, power, again, especially like wealth or like honor reputation, power it's a good. And again, Aquinas is not saying you should have no power. The question is, can it be your highest good? And what we see is the same problem. Power has the same sort of attributes of wealth in this respect. You have the problem of always plus one, right? You can always potentially be more powerful than you actually already are. You can be powerful and be bad, so the same problem as with fame. And then power is also like wealth, that it's power in order to what? You want to be powerful in order to what? To have power? You want to have power in order to what? Well, you could say, I want to have power in order to have money. Okay, well, in that case, that power, what the definition would be, well, then power is subordinate to wealth. But then we go back to wealth and say, well, wealth is subordinate to something else. So again, it's when we look at human behavior and we see how much is motivated by power, how much is motivated by money, how much is motivated by wanting to be liked. What Aquinas is just asking us to see is, again, not that people don't do this, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So we're sort of trapped in these self-imposed cycles of behavior that ultimately lead to frustration and anxiety, in the sense that we can't actually get what it is that we're trying to get. Deep down, we know that, and yet we still try and do it. And so we create this deep conflict within us in such a way that we're going to be temporally unhappy all the time, except for perhaps brief moments when we have the slightest ephemeral enjoyment of something, having obtained it, but then it dissolves almost immediately because we want more. This is a recipe for disaster. It's also how most of us, if not all of us, in some way or another, live our lives without structuring them back according to the true nature of reality. So power's good, but can't be the ultimate good. Pleasure. Well, how about pleasure? Okay. Pleasure is a serious one, because who really is against pleasure? And here we can include bodily pleasure, and we could include mental pleasure. And there are some philosophies, for example, utilitarianism, which overtly say pleasure is the highest good, beyond which there is no other good. So again, we're not saying here within this paradigm that pleasure is bad, or that we shouldn't take pleasure, identify pleasure as a potentially great good. But the question would be, well, can it be the ultimate great good? The answer for Aquinas, for many of the same reasons we've always identified, is going to be no. So think about the nature of pleasure and what pleasure is actually like. What is pleasurable? Well, if we're thinking about it in sort of a biological sense, and the more we know about this, about the release of certain chemicals in the brain, right? It's connected to, in a strictly speaking physical sense, it's connected to certain kinds of chemicals. Well, you know what we've figured out ever since human beings have been around, but it's gotten more and more advanced, just like everything else, is we've figured out certain kinds of chemicals that we can introduce to stimulate those parts of our brain, so we get a sort of a flood of those chemicals in our brain. It can feel really, really, really good. You know what they're called? Drugs. Things like heroin, right? Or the hardest drugs. I've never taken them, not going to take them. Hope you don't, because it'll kill you. But it is immensely pleasurable, apparently, in a physical sense. But at the same time that you get that release, and talk to anybody who's ever used, you get that release, there's a both a biological and a psychological component attached. One, the release is temporary, right? It comes into existence and already begins to fade from existence as soon as it comes into existence. So that's sort of the biological, right? The chemical flux is a flux. It's gonna peak and then it's gonna go down. And psychologically, right, we know that as well. So again, it's this kind of like parasitic anxiety that attaches to the pleasure that says it's going to end, 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 which is already doing what? Pointing to the next experience. So you're in and through the pleasurable moment, and as you're passing through the pleasurable moment, you're already opening yourself to the search for the next pleasurable moment, which, again, using biological parallels here, will not only have to be the same level, it will have to be what? It'll have to be more intense. And more intense, 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 and more intense. Maybe that's getting a little annoying. I keep saying that, but think about living your life as if pleasure were your highest good. You're, again, setting yourself up for failure, because pleasure can also always be a +1. We can always conceive of something a little bit more pleasurable than whatever it is we're experiencing. And that includes not just biological in the sense of physical pleasures, like the release of chemicals into our bloodstream, but also mental pleasures. So, you know, like looking at a great piece of art, or looking at a beautiful sunset, or being engaged in a really amazing conversation with your friend. There's something about the structure of even truly beautiful things, but temporal things, that they have an expiration date, right? We're not happy just doing the same thing over and over and over again. We want to add a new dimension to it. Well, then we could build into the model, well, okay, yeah, but, you know, we're after pleasure, but we know pleasure's not going to last forever. So then we can, well, then we can remember fondly the pleasurable times that we had, and that'll be pleasurable. So that's like a secondary residual pleasure. So we're going to recognize that, yes, our pleasures come to an end, but well, then we'll be able to remember the pleasures. So it's like, okay, remember the pleasure. But what are you doing as you remember the pleasures? Doesn't sound like a recipe for a happy life. Is to have as much pleasure as possible, but then to spend the rest of the time before you expire just remembering those pleasures. Meanwhile, living in order to do what? To live in the past. So again, Aquinas is not saying people don't try to do this, but he's saying that we will fail to do it, and we will know that we will fail to do it because of the nature of pleasure, because of the nature of what it means to be human, and because we know. So again, we're setting ourselves up for something that we know we're going to fail at, and still trying to do it. So pleasure is not bad, but pleasure cannot be the highest good. Well, how about health? Health can be understood as longevity, and longevity without pain. But insofar as we've built no pain into here, we're back into the pleasure category, which we've already, at least from Aquinas' perspective, said that can't be. So how about just living as long as possible? I saw an advertisement the other day on the freeway that said the first person to be born to 150 years, the first person to live to 150 years has already been born, meaning that somewhere around like 2018, 2017, I can't remember exactly when I saw the billboard, someone's already been born, someone's already been in existence who's going to live up to 150. And I thought, wow, 150, that's a lot. But when I saw that billboard, I was actually I started thinking of Aquinas and thinking of this category. And I thought to myself, well, 150 is a lot, but I mean, why not 175? Why not 200? Why not 250? Why don't we go half a millennium? Why don't we go 1,000, right? I mean, we could just start dealing up and saying, well, yeah, but one more year, one more year, one more year, one more year. And so the question will be, well, you'd want that extra time in order to do what? So even health, you see, becomes its own kind of currency. Health is something to spend, as it were, on something else. Just being alive, being in existence, doesn't answer the question what you're in existence for. It's sort of the condition for the possibility for acting. You have to be alive, but it's not the goal for action itself. Now, again, that doesn't mean that protecting your health is bad, or acting in accordance with the natural functions of your body is bad. By no means is it saying that. It's saying it can't be your highest good, because one, there's always another potential level of health. You could always be a little fitter, a little more in tune with your body. There's the +1 problem. And there's also the issue of you'd be living extra years in order to have pleasure. Well, but we said that. In order to get more power, huh? In order to get more fame, no. In order for more people to know you. So again, it becomes a currency, and then we recognize that what we're spending it on also can't be the highest good as well, so no health. All right, so then to conclude, Aquinas says, maybe I'm forgetting something. Maybe there's something else, and again, the condition is in time and space. Maybe there's something else in existence that doesn't fit within one of these categories that I'm overlooking. So what could that potentially be? Well, one answer, and he doesn't address this particularly in this section, but we can certainly extract from his thought, is to say, well, how about something like love? And he would say, yes, but remember, the condition for the definition of happiness here would have to be something else in the world. So it would have to be love in the world. Okay. Not eternal love. Eternal love, you can probably see where this is headed, right? Eternal love is the right answer for him. It's living in relationship with God for all eternity, and taking rest in God's existence, and being in that sort of the perpetual enjoyment, not desire, enjoyment. That's where we're headed with all this. But how about let's take seriously love? Well, remember we've looked in previous lectures, different forms of love. There's eros, there's philia, and there's agape. Now let's look at eros, philia, and agape as it relates to temporal love, not eternal love, but temporal love. Well, if we're talking eros and you're in a relationship, right, and it's structured by the desire to have unity with the object of your love, and again, eros is where we get ideas of sexual love as well. That's typically associated with a kind of pleasure, and insofar as you are engaged in this form of love, it certainly can be pleasurable, and it doesn't just have to be sexualized. It can be just the unity of two people. It can certainly be pleasurable, but then you're saying, well, that there can be more of it. It can be more of it if that's your only criterion, right? There can be more of it. There can be more of it. There can be more of it. So then you've got the +1 problem. You also have the issue, and this will go for the other ones as well, is that we lose people all the time, or we're the ones who get lost. And again, we know that we can suppress these kinds of existential anxieties to the point of maybe, being relatively hidden from time to time, but they're there, and they eventually pop up to remind us, you know what? You're mortal. You know what? Everyone else around you also mortal. So we can act as if a love in this life, an eros love in this life, will fulfill everything that we want, but we're going to know that, one, there's the +1 problem, and two, at some point it will fall apart. At some point it will end. So if I'm putting all my chips on the table for something that I know eventually is going to be taken away from me, and ultimately I have no control, right? Think about that. Ultimately we have no control, zero control, if we're speaking just from a temporal perspective. Right? If you cut off the transcendent and just talk about living in time and space with no connection to eternal reality, we ultimately have zero control. Zero control. Now we could say, well, don't you have control about ending your life? I suppose you do. Maybe suicide is the kind of control, but what a terrible control! What a terrible freedom! Like that's what we're going to have, and that's what we're going to hang our hat in, is that I can take myself out of existence whenever I choose. Like that would be saying our greatest freedom is not life, but death. It's the absolute inversion of anything attached to love. Think about being in a relationship with somebody who says to you, you know what, at any given time, I'm going to tell you that based upon whatever I want and only what I want, I'm going to take myself out of existence and you just deal with the consequences and I love you. Like that's it. That's not love. That's pure egoism. It's the exact opposite of love, right? So even if we locate sort of the freedom to take oneself out of existence as the only freedom that ultimately exists within time and space, if that's all there is, then it has nothing to do with love, right? It's saying that death is our highest freedom. So that's dark. That's dark. I don't know if we want to go there, okay? So yes, that we may have control of, but nothing else, right? Again, if we locate life just within the horizon of time and space and say there's no eternal purpose or anything like that. So again, we engage in love and can say like this is giving us lots of meaning and purpose, but we're going to do it underneath the implicit recognition and explicit recognition sometimes that can pop out in like severe anxiety or depression, that it's all going to end anyway. Okay, so love wouldn't work in this model. Eros, same would be with philia, friendship. Again, this is not saying any of these things are bad. Friendship is a great good. Being in a relationship potentially can be a great good with that dimension of Eros, but it's saying it can't be the greatest good. One of the things that happens to everybody who gets old, and you see it in your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, we'll eventually see it ourselves if we get up to those ages, is you start losing friends one by one by one. And one of your regular activities, and this is depressing, right, to bring this up, but we're trying to talk about sort of the most important questions that have to do with existence and being alive and so forth. So we would ignore this at our own peril. One of the most common activities as you get old enough, not common, that's overstating, but a very common activity is to start going to your friends' funerals if you happen to be living in relatively close distance. You see it with, again, with your grandparents or with your great-grandparents. It becomes very common. So if you've invested your whole life in a person as a friend, you got to know that eventually you'll be alone or you'll leave them alone. Now, agape love is, if we just, and there's the question whether agape even just fits into a temporal paradigm. It might not, but let's try and manipulate it a bit so we can just sort of stuff it into time and space and say there's nothing there. So agape is this idea that you love others independent of any kind of response that they may give you. Again, it doesn't mean you don't desire a response, but that your love isn't dependent upon that response. Well, even here, if you're loving agapeically outside of any eternal framework, you're at the very least, you're going to have the +1 problem. This idea like there's always more people I potentially could be helping, always more people I could potentially be serving, always more people that I could potentially be bringing into the ambit of my love. And so even if agape is a bit more robust than eros and philia, it still would be limited by the +1 problem if it's just in time and space. So Aquinas' conclusion would be that love, temporal love, even if you have the unity of eros, philia, and agape, which is what you get in a marriage, right? And a marriage that creates children, right? When two people come together and create a family, and that family is bound together by the woman and the man being attracted to each other and desiring to be unified, and then creating new life if they're biologically able to in that relationship, and also being best friends, and in terms of their being best friends, also seeking each other's good in an objective way, and in such an objective way that even if one of them gets sick, even if one of them goes into a coma, right, the relationship will stay intact as long as the other person. This is where within the Catholic tradition, at least, marriage is understood as a sacrament, because it's bound up by a love that won't die, based upon conditions. Even then, if you were to cut off that connection to the supernatural, Aquinas would argue at the very least, it's going to fall apart. Even the best marriages are going to end. Now, one thing in terms of, not necessarily in divorce, but in terms of one partner dying before the other, one spouse dying before the other. So, and it goes with kids as well. You can have the best possible relationship with your children. That would be setting aside eros, right? So eros is only appropriate in some context, but it could be philia and agape. But even relationships with children can fall apart, and not even, I don't even mean they're just with death. Children and parents can become enemies with each other. So that too can fall apart. So even under the best case scenario of love in its totality in time and space, it can and it will fall apart. So for that reason, and Aquinas thinks that, I use love because that's oftentimes an example that comes up as like, well, maybe a love can fill in the gap here. Love and anything else for Aquinas, if it's just within time and space, is not going to cut it. So what this means is what? This means that we all know, and I'm speaking in Aquinas' voice here, right? And of course, everything that we're talking about in this whole class and every lecture, ultimately, I try and present the argument as cogently and powerfully as I can from within the structure and the motivation of the argument itself. But every one of you, ultimately, you have to say yes or no, right? So this is Aquinas talking. What Aquinas would say is that we all know and that we are made for something beyond time and space. That our actions, that the goal beyond our goal, beyond the 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 goal, is ultimately to obtain unity. And this unity would be a unity of love, of eros, not sexualized, but a desire for unity, of friendship, philia, and of agape with the divine. And we can do that, he will argue, and this will be the subject of the next lectures in Aquinas, through acting in a particular way in time and space, but ultimately doing all of that to have a supernatural relationship, or put it simply, life after death with God. He thinks we all know that. It's literally written into our bones. It's written into our DNA. It's written into our soul. The problem is that we act as if that weren't true. We act as if a reality that we know to be false were true. And this is the condition of sin. This is the problem of sin. It's the inversion and the creation, that the taking of what is, which actually is good, and the reorganization of it in a particular kind of way that not only perverts it and twists it, but actually creates a nothingness. It's a moving out of existence. That's the problem of sin. So again, he thinks we know that's true, but that doesn't stop us from trying to live according to a false reality. Now let me end with this point. This is not an argument for the existence of God. And Aquinas doesn't intend this to be an argument for the existence of God. That's not his purpose. We haven't had the time to go through them here, but he does provide other arguments that he believes that can identify, from a rational perspective, that God does exist and that God is our highest good. He thinks that our reason is capable of coming to those conclusions. Not the special revelation conclusions of God being Trinity or God coming into time and space in the form of Jesus the Christ, but that God existing as the ground and goal of all reality. He thinks that's true. But he's not making that argument here. The argument he's making is basically this. We are made, the only happiness we can potentially have, the purpose of our life is we are made for God. We are made for unity, relationship with the divine. So while this doesn't provide that God does exist, if God doesn't exist, then the conclusion would be, and this is pretty terrifying if you look at through his perspective, would be that we are made, if we're just cosmic accidents, but we have the nature that we have, then we are made for misery. We've come into existence for existential hell, in the sense that we live in a world that we know doesn't care anything about us and that has no meaning or purpose, and that any path that we choose to try and give ourselves meaning and purpose, making money or getting other people to like us or trying to be famous or becoming powerful, but we can do that, we can choose to do that, but as we do it, we know that it's not going to make us happy. Well, this is the ingredients for existential anxiety of the worst sort, right? Because you can't escape it, and there's not going to be a drug that's going to pull you out of it, because as you take the drug, you're going to be knowing you're taking the drug, knowing that it's not actually fixing the metaphysical problem, that no one cares, right? So that's the stakes of this question. Is that if he's right that we are made this way, and that we know that we're made this way, then if there's not a God, all of us are not only living illusions in the sense of, creating these fantasy worlds, but we're doing so, creating the fantasy worlds, knowing that they're fantasy worlds, and knowing that at the end of that park that we've created, that little theme park we've created, is the only reality that actually exists, which is darkness. Now, the good news from Aquinas' perspective, at least, would be, well, that you don't have to worry about. That existential anxiety is not real, because there is a God. And there is a God who not only exists, but who is invested in human life and in your life, and who is inviting you to a relationship and to happiness. So that he doesn't go off into that dark territory. He thinks there's no reason to go off that dark territory. In fact, reason, properly speaking, directs us into the light. But it's the stakes of the question, right? So here's what I want you to think about, and you have to come to your totally own conclusion about this. If Aquinas is wrong, then what's the alternative for you, both in your definition of happiness and in your definition of sort of your end goal, and in your definition of how you structure your life in order to obtain that happiness? Again, that's a question not only that I invite you to answer as part of this course, but in one way or another, you can't not answer, insofar as you're living, making choices, and ostensibly after something. What is it? Why is it there? And how are you going to get it? All right, to be continued. We'll be looking at the next lecture at this question here. For Aquinas, if our highest good is a relationship with God, then the next question will be, well, how do we get it? What's the causal process to get that relationship? So that will be the content of the next lecture. See you again soon.